This episode is proudly sponsored by two people I have a lot of admiration for. That is Dr. Gleicher and Dr. Barad. They are the partners at the Center for Human Reproduction in New York City. It's a wonderful place that focuses on helping people have children at an advanced maternal age, which is really hard to find in this day and age. And as you will see in this episode, they do amazing work. Is it important for you to use your own eggs to build your family? Or have you thought about using donor eggs, but you're just not ready to pursue it? If so, this episode is for you. Usually we talk about donor conception and surrogacy and different ways to build a family, but it's not right for everyone. For emotional, cultural, or religious reasons, many people don't want to pursue ovum donation. So it's important for them to understand that there are options. This week, we're going to meet two doctors from the Center for Human Reproduction, Dr. Gleicher and Dr. Barad. They are fantastic doctors who are compassionate and kind, but also use research-based methods to think about how they're going to get their patients pregnant. Their average age is much older than you would expect, and they have many ways of thinking about human reproduction in ways that probably you've never thought of. So tune in because they're going to talk about some of those ways this week on this episode. I think you'll really like it. Welcome to Building Your Family. This is a podcast about donor conception, fertility treatment, surrogacy, and all the ways the modern family is built. My name is Lisa Schumann. I'm your host. I'm an author, a therapist, a researcher, and I am passionate about helping people have a better path to parenthood and an easier parenting experience. Now, today on our podcast, we're going to have a little bit of a change of pace. We're going to talk about something that we don't often talk about, which is getting pregnant at an advanced maternal age. We're going to talk about some of the science behind this. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I am not interested in anecdotal stories about how people eat pineapple or do all of these kind of silly things to get pregnant. I'm very interested in the research and helping people have a focused and educated idea about how they can build their family. And so today we have some special guests. Both of the partners of the Center for Human Reproduction are joining us today. So Dr. Barad is the first person, and he is director and senior scientist of the program. He's been recognized by the American Fertility Association, and his dedication and support to individuals experiencing infertility, and has been awarded a master's degree in clinical research as well. He's published extensively in the field of reproductive endocrinology, and his research is mostly focused on improving reproductive outcomes for women with diminished ovarian reserve. Dr. Gleicher founded the clinic, and he also holds an appointment as guest investigator at Rockefeller University and professor at Medical University in Vienna. He's published over 500 peer-reviewed scientific papers, hundreds of abstracts, and book chapters in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. He served as founding editor-in-chief for the American Journal of Reproductive Immunology and founding editor of the Journal of Assisted Reproduction and Genetics. So that is a mouthful for both of you, but both of you have done so well and so many wonderful things for women. And I want to also say one of the things that I'm amazed at and really admire is that also with each step in scientific research, you're also so thoughtful about giving patients informed consent, making sure that the patients understand if they pursue alternate methods to parenthood or if they decide to move forward with reproductive medicine at an advanced maternal age, they really understand what the risks are. And I really appreciate that because we find that as being very rare in our world. And so I'm very grateful for that as well. So that's enough from me. I'd like to hear from both of you. What got you into this angle in reproductive medicine? What made you decide that you really wanted to focus on helping women get pregnant with their own eggs or focus on the advancement of reproductive endocrinology, not just in terms of third-party reproduction, but also in fertility treatment?
Mostly it was an unserved population. As Dr. Gleisch will agree with me, these people come in and oftentimes they're still cycling. Oftentimes they're still producing good numbers of eggs. They even produce embryos. and people are other docs are just moving them right on into donor egg. Now we're old enough to remember when we started IVF a few years ago. Back then, pregnancy rates were 10-15% at best. And these days, with these patients, we can often offer them 15, 20, 25% pregnancy rates. Why push them on to donor egg just because the chances are better? It's not that they can't get pregnant, it's that they have reduced chances of getting pregnant, but they want to get pregnant with their own eggs. And why not give them the opportunity to try? Do you agree?
And I want to go a little bit even beyond that. David mentioned it's an underserved area. It is a very much underserved area because when you look at national data, I know you're data driven. So we have probably the most comprehensive registry of IVF outcomes of any country in the world. And when you look at the US data, age-wise, it is astonishing how few IVF cycles are happening above age 42, 43. And that says it all. As David noted, once a woman reaches that age, most clinics will pretty automatically direct women today into egg donation. Now, they have a point, but it's just a point. It is not an appropriate final decision because we as a center differentiate ourselves also in the sense that we do not feel qualified to tell patients how to live their lives. But we do feel very qualified, probably better than many of our colleagues qualified, in telling them in detail what their options are and with brutal honesty afterwards what their chances are with those various options. But then the decision is theirs. It's not ours. Because I cannot tell a patient to take a 10 or 15% chance when she may have a 40, 50% chance with donor eggs. How can I make that decision for a patient?
Yeah, and people need to be able to know those options and know that they can make that decision. Some people just feel very strongly that they want to try to have that link with their children, and I understand that. I also understand that it's not absolutely necessary, and at some point, people may need to move on to donor eggs because the the end goal is to establish a family and not be spending a lot of time and money on doctor's visits. But they deserve a chance, and many people, many places are not even offering them that chance. And because we have the opportunity to see these people, we have a lot of experience of what we can do to try to optimize those chances.
I can say that, it's so wonderful to see, not just when I'm speaking to the two of you, but when I'm at medical conferences, people bring up your research because it's very well known. And I see how hard you're both still working at trying to solve these problems for women that, our eggs are really not kind to us as we get older. And you're continuing to not just fit the round peg into the round hole, but trying to figure out how to do it differently, how to find different ways for patients to get pregnant with their own eggs, whether they want to build their family that way or whether they just want a second chance before they move on to donor eggs. And I see that people come to you from all over the world to do that. How have you been able to manage that? That's takes a lot of stamina because you're constantly trying to find the needle in the haystack that's going to help somebody do something that's going to be difficult to do.
I would call it a conscious strategy. It's probably what, David, 15 years ago, maybe even a little longer, that we as a center made a conscious decision to concentrate on the older ovary. And what I mean by that is, as you noted, we are not only a clinical fertility center, we also are very research driven. We spend a lot of resources and a lot of time research. And we made that conscious decision, not that we wouldn't research other stuff, but that the core of our interest, both research-wise and clinical, would be the old ovary. And that started feeding upon itself. And what I mean by that is that as we learned more in our research and were able to apply it and got a few additional percentage points of pregnancy chance out of it for our older patients, the word got out. And suddenly we had more older patients coming to us locally, and then it was nationally, and then it was international. Over time, our more difficult patient population therefore grew, and we just analyzed our 2023 results, and we reached another milestone because for the first time, the median age of our patients in 2023 hit 44. That means that only over half of our patients were older than 44 when they came to us. And only 16% of our patients were under age 40. And even they were not normal.
They mostly are people who have already failed, 5 or 6 cycles elsewhere before they came to us. Yeah.
But this creates, paradoxically, a unique opportunity. And that opportunity reminds me of what David also referred to, the early days of IVF. We are both old enough to have participated in the initial stages of IVF. One of the big advantages in those days was how quickly we could figure out when something was working. We didn't need big prospectively randomized studies because the pregnancy rates were so lousy that when something worked, we instantly knew it. And to a degree, we have that same advantage in our patient population now because their inherent expectations, and frankly, our expectations for them, are obviously much lower pregnancy chances than most other infertility centers have, which have on average usually a 36-year-old patient population. And therefore, when something works, we see it. Therefore, we constantly can adjust what we are doing. And again, that starts feeding upon itself because we have really made some amazing milestones that allow us to help a lot of patients who otherwise would not even be given the chance.
That's incredible. We certainly know that there are some people who will eventually say, I want to pursue ovum donation because I want to have a child, but some people won't, right? It's not right for everyone. And some people say, if I can't use my own eggs, I'm not going to have children. And so those people deserve a chance, right?
And there are people who, for cultural or religious reasons, are simply not able to.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And do you find, you raised the issue of what it used to be like in fertility treatment. I know when I was going through fertility treatment myself a very long time ago, transferring a 3-day embryo was kind of the norm. And now it's, completely outrageous, right? And kind of common circles. But you're using a combination of different ways of thinking about incorporating how we used to think about things, how we think about things now, and also you're incorporating issues around how can we look at immunology, how can we look at cell division, all of these different issues within each patient process. Where do you find the most impact, or is it even fair to say that there's one versus the other?
I think the answer is both complex and simple at the same time, because the answer is there is no answer. Every patient is different. And another principle that we understood quite a while ago here at the CHR, because as David mentioned, most of the patients who come to us have had lots of IVF cycles before elsewhere. It doesn't make sense for us to repeat what everybody has done with them already and failed. And therefore, simply the history of those patients mandates that we give them a different kind of treatment. Now, that doesn't mean that the basic principles of the IVF they're getting here are not the same. They take fertility drugs, they get monitored, etc. Same thing. But I give you only a few examples. There's hardly a patient who comes in, has her baseline investigations, and starts an IVF cycle. Because in the vast majority, we will first try to maximize the performance of their ovaries before we start even an IVF cycle. And I always make the analogy to cleaning out the car engine. You know, if you don't want to put in a new engine and you want to get the best out of the old one, you have to clean it. And we are not yet at the point where we can make new eggs. We will get there hopefully within a few years, but we are not there yet. And therefore we have to do with what's there. We cannot make more of it, but we can try before we even start to maximize the environment. And then again, how they're stimulated, how much medication they get. 7, 8 years ago, we made a very important discovery, namely that as women get older, everything seems to be happening quicker in ovaries. That's also a reason why as women get older, their cycles become shorter. Therefore, their eggs, if you leave them in as long as you would leave them in a younger person, they overcook. We jokingly call this producing hard-boiled instead of soft-boiled eggs. And once our research discovered that, the obvious question became, okay, so what can we do to prevent them from overcooking? And the only answer was, obviously, we have to take them out earlier. Now, if you go to any IVF center almost in the world, they will tell you that every IVF cycle gets triggered, and you may remember that still from your own days, when the lead follicle, the biggest follicle, reaches somewhere between 18, 19 to 22 millimeters. I can tell you, and probably not surprising since you already know what the age of our patients are, that is today the absolute exception at our center. I think the only women who get triggered at those follicle sizes are egg donors. Our routine today is 11, 12 millimeters, sometimes even smaller. So it's a completely different IVF cycle from what these patients
Lisa,
had
what we've experienced is that if you allow in a 44-year-old, 43-year-old, allow the follicles to go on to what others would do. In other words, they're using, an antagonist or something to allow the follicles to get to be 18, 19, 20 millimeters. You oftentimes will end up with, an egg that's really doesn't have any energy anymore. It's become atretic. They don't divide well. They don't fertilize well. And we were quite surprised that as we started, triggering people earlier at these earlier stages, we're getting mature eggs from, 12, 13, 14 millimeter follicles. And we're getting better embryos than we would if we continued them on out to that what others would have considered to be fully mature. It's just that the follicle over time loses its ability to continue to support the egg. The follicle itself becomes atretic as they get bigger and bigger, and it's no longer supporting that egg. And you end up with as Dr. Gleicher said, an egg that's overcooked and just can't produce a viable embryo.
It's amazing. So you're starting from a completely different premise just from the beginning.
And the other thing is, we started this years ago. Most places are looking at a cycle as occurring, the 2 weeks from the menstrual period to the ovulation. Maybe they do some priming for 10 days before. We start priming our patients' ovaries, a month or two before they start the cycle. with various things. Just again to try to build up. We tried to build up the antral follicle count. We tried to build up the AMH. And there's various ways that we go about it, and we're actually kind of going back and back and back to see what we can do earlier on, just to build up the ovary and try to make it work. And we even have people coming in who have been diagnosed with premature ovarian failure that we're trying
Wow.
to bring along, and oftentimes we get something from them for them.
One of the questions that we hear most frequently is when new patients come, usually, as I said, after they had been through multiple cycles, often at different centers, what are you going to do different? And the only answer we can give them is really everything except for the basics, that it's IVF. But every detail of an IVF cycle today is different. And if you had 7, 8 years, 9 years ago told both of us that we would trigger women at 10, 11 millimeter lead follicle size and get mature eggs at the same ratio as in younger women with the standard follicle sizes, I would have declared you insane. But that is our routine, considering our patients. Our exception today are the bigger follicles.
Yeah, I'm currently reviewing some cycles. They're back over the last 4 or 5 years that we had some in some experimental protocols. And I'm kicking myself that we didn't trigger these people back at 12, because back then we kept trying to push them. I had people who came in and they had a follicle at 12 millimeters and estrogen of 200 or 300 or something like that. We saw we had to push them to 14 or 16 or 18 millimeters, and those follicles died. But we probably could have gotten something if we triggered them earlier. And that's what we've learned since then. Yeah.
That's incredible. So you mentioned that you do everything differently. One thing that I hear a lot is your research on mosaic embryos. So can you tell the audience a little something about that?
PGD, which they used to call it, started out being an experiment, where they would just stain the chromosomes with fish and try to identify a few chromosomes. And even way back then, we were doing that, and we were eliminating what looked like nice looking embryos that other people who weren't doing PGD were getting pregnant with similar embryos. Other patients in our practice that weren't doing it. And we became skeptical of it, and we started looking at that. In fact, Norbert and I wrote a paper that we tried to get it accepted somewhere, criticizing all that. And Norbert, you tell that story better than I do.
We actually reanalyzed the first studies on testing embryos' chromosomal makeup. Those studies were published by Belgian investigators. In those days, everybody, including us initially, believed very strongly that if we were to eliminate all embryos that were chromosomally abnormal, the remaining embryos would give us much better pregnancy. It seemed to make sense because we knew from miscarriages that a lot of the miscarriages were chromosomally abnormal. And then came the big surprise when our Belgian colleagues published their first 3 studies in different patient populations. And in none of those studies were they able to find any outcome benefits from testing those embryos chromosomally. Outcomes weren't worse, but they were not better. And then we reanalyzed their data, looking at age as an additional factor. And we concluded from their data, wasn't our patient, wasn't any involved. We concluded that likely this new testing of embryos not only didn't improve outcomes, as their studies had shown, but in older women actually may reduce pregnancy chances. And that's the paper David was referring to. We wrote, and we couldn't get it published. We couldn't get it published in all of our fertility journals. We couldn't get it published in general medical journals because everybody at that time, and I fully understand it, believed this is going to revolutionize IVF. And nobody believed that it might not do it, and certainly didn't believe, as we said, that it may be harmful to some patients. Cut a long story short, roughly 2 years after we had first written that paper, some Swedish colleagues got a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that exactly demonstrated what we had predicted, that in older patients, selecting so-called chromosomally abnormal embryos would actually reduce pregnancy chances. And that paper, since it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, obviously got a lot of attention. And actually, the editor of one of the leading journals in our field called me up and said, "Didn't you send me something a while back about this?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "Send it back to me." And as we sent it back, and our paper got published a few months after that Swedish paper. But as David noted, from reanalyzing the Belgian data, we, for the first time, became really skeptical about the whole concept. And then something very interesting happened, which is, I think, not only happening in our field, but it is unfortunately quite typical for medicine in general. And that is that economic interests started coming into play.
How so?
The testing of embryos creates economic value. It creates economic value for IVF clinics, and it creates economic value for the genetic testing industry.
Yes.
And the genetic industry used this fact very ingeniously by splitting the economic interest, with the IVF clinics doing the embryo biopsy and the genetic laboratory doing the analysis. And so there's a strong economic interest on both sides. And that has been, I'm convinced of it, and there's, I think, now some quite significant data in support of that belief, that has convinced the field to put how science is usually done on its head. Because if you speak to a physician scientist, I think none will ever disagree that the burden of proof for something is upon the party that wants to introduce something new into medicine. And here, with this field of testing embryos, that was put on its head, because in the meanwhile, growing genetic testing industry and everything connected with it continued making the argument it's working. The excuses were, our technology wasn't good enough. We have now better technology. Now it will work. But they never showed proof that it really worked. And so what happened is that the proof of burden was put on people like us who questioned that it worked. And so when you look at the history of chromosomal testing, there were 2 or 3 stages where significant discoveries occurred on a scientific level, always supporting our position that chromosomal testing does not work. And the genetic industry basically took that as a reason to bring out the new program. PGTA 1, PGTA 2, PGTA 3, always claiming, now we have better technology. Now it will show the expected results. And many colleagues for whom it still made sense, in addition, have been following. And so for us, really, the big breaking point came in 2014, where we then said, okay, if we are right and they are wrong, if we take some of the embryos that they claim are chromosomally abnormal and therefore should be thrown out, if we transfer them and get normal babies, that's basically the ultimate proof.
Yes.
So we started with informed consent, doing exactly that in 2014, and presented in 2015 at the annual ASRM meeting our first 4 healthy pregnancies following such transfers to a packed house. Everybody was just flabbergasted.
And still are, by the way.
A few weeks later, Italian colleagues published 6 healthy pregnancy following such transfers. Even that still did not convince our colleagues. Further basic research that really demonstrated, partially by us in collaboration with colleagues at Rockefeller University. We had a paper in one of the Nature journals where, based on single cell analysis, which had become possible by that point, we could demonstrate that almost every embryo at blastocyst stage, which is when we biopsied for PGTA, has chromosomally abnormal cell. In other words, chromosomal abnormalities at that stage in an embryo are basically normal and may actually have a physiological function. There may be a reason why there are chromosomally abnormal embryos at that stage.
You opened the conversation, Lisa, by asking about Mosaicism. And I'll tell you, 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago at ASRM, I asked the question to the PGT group, well, what about Mosaicism? And they said, well, Mosaicism is not very common in these people. And they were
2-3%.
Yeah.
Those were the numbers the geneticists threw it out. The truth is, as I said, it's almost universal.
So it depends on, when they're biopsying these embryos, they're testing 3, 4, 5, 6 cells. And when they had the earlier technology, they were not able to see very clearly what they were doing. So initially, embryos that were diagnosed as aneuploid with these earlier techniques actually were what they would today probably label as mosaic. Practices all over the country were refusing to transfer these embryos because they were aneuploid. Now, it may be that a mosaic embryo like that has a less chance of becoming a healthy baby than a so-called embryo with a euploid biopsy. But we're seeing patients who only have one embryo or maybe 2 embryos, and they had no, quote, euploid embryos, and they were being refused transfer. And so what did we do? We started giving a home to those embryos, and people were moving those embryos here and from other places that had refused to transfer them. Okay, these weren't PGT cases that we did ourselves. These were embryos that came to us because the lawyers or the physicians at these places refused to transfer the embryos, and they convinced patients that if they transferred these embryos, they'd end up with some sort of monster baby or something like that, which really isn't the case. The case is that an embryo that implants, we're old enough to have done IVF for 25 years or so before there was PGTA, and we know what happened. We were transferring these embryos, and we know we weren't getting monster babies, so it didn't make sense that just because we knew what they were today, that they were going to get some sort of problem, and we began transferring them, and we ended up with a lot of babies from that, and they're babies that wouldn't be in the world if we didn't take those embryos here and give them a home.
And those mothers probably would have ended up with donor eggs on top of it.
Or not
Or
having
adopting.
children.
Yeah.
Or not having a baby at all.
Right.
Exactly.
So for all of you who are listening to this, you may not be clear about what happens in the lab, but there has to be a decision made about whether or not an embryo is healthy. And what this practice has done has looked at some embryos that were formerly considered unhealthy and been able to use them. And many of them have become healthy, and they've received a lot of accolades for this research. And I think it's really interesting, a couple of points that you're making also is that one, you're not talking about a 25-year-old woman who has perfect eggs. You're talking about people maybe who otherwise would not be able to have a child, and why not try it? But I think the other point that you mentioned earlier, which is so important, I think just across the board, is this fear factor, right? People get so scared. Well, I'm going to have a child with Down syndrome. I'm going to have a child with all these issues. And what you really need, which both of you provide, is informed consent. If you're using these embryos, there's always a risk. And are you willing to take this risk? And many people would go in with their eyes wide open and say, yes, I'm willing to take this risk. If I was getting pregnant at home by accident, this might happen anyway. And so I'm willing to do that. And if I'm not, they don't need to proceed. But I think that's so key and so different from many other people out there who are trying all kinds of things, because the patients really need to go into this with their eyes wide open.
So in general, we would try not to transfer an embryo that had a diagnosis of a trisomy 21, which would be Down syndrome, or some of the other known viable abnormalities. It's only fair to give people the chance.
And I want to give the field credit. It has taken a long time, but I think we have reached a turning point. Even colleagues who were amongst the most outspoken proponents of testing embryos and throwing out every embryo that has a alleged chromosomal abnormality are now agreeing that at least some of those embryos can be transferred and will have basically normal pregnancy rates for IVF. So that's already an enormous step forward. They're still not at the whole truth because they are still refusing too many embryos transfers, but there has been an enormous shift, I would say, over the last 1-2 years.
And on the other side of the coin, having had the experience of dealing with many of these embryos that have had abnormal biopsies, we're coming to realize that some embryos with multiple problems probably have a very small chance, if any, of achieving a pregnancy, and we encourage our patients not to go there. At the same time, there was a recent paper, actually a recent letter that came from one of the embryo testing companies that demonstrated that, and a paper published, a case report published, that sometimes embryos with multiple abnormalities seen on the biopsy, sometimes those abnormalities are artifact. This company showed that among embryos that had what they call chaotic biopsies, meaning in that case, I think it was more than 8 abnormalities, when they retested those embryos, close to 40% of them were normal.
Wow. That's incredible.
So there are, both sides of this coin. There's still opportunities for artifact. Yeah.
New York, from one of the universities, last year published a paper where they just decided to transfer an embryo without retesting it. It was reported to have 8 abnormalities, and they had a perfectly healthy baby.
Yeah.
So we are making progress.
It's incredible.
And that's important. We are not there yet, but we are making progress. And this is not only happening in the infertility field. This is happening in medicine everywhere. There are studies out that show that it takes on the average 17, 18 years from an important discovery in the lab at the bench to trickle down into routine daily practice.
Wow. That's a shame. That's really a shame. Well, I'm glad that you're doing all this incredible research. And speaking of which, you talked about you have many tools in your toolbox to try to help women. One other thing I wanted to touch on that you're also very well known for is revisiting immunology. So I remember 20 years ago or so, that was the hot topic, and it's kind of fallen out of favor. And so but both of you have taken another look at it in various forms, right? In various ways. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
I'm actually coming from an immunology background. I did an immunology fellowship in my early career. As you said, at a time when for the first time medicine felt that we will cure cancer through immunology. Those were the late 70s, mid to late 70s. For that reason, when I had a break between my internship and my residency start of 6 months, and I was given by my department chair at Sinai the opportunity for a basic research fellowship during those 6 months. And he gave me the choice between doing it in what then was one of the world's leading endocrine laboratories or in a much less well-known immunology laboratory. And because I felt like many at that time that immunology would solve all medical problems out there, I chose the immunology fellowship, and it was very, very helpful in my career. And it's also has been one of the reasons why we always have been placing a lot of emphasis on immunology, and why we very strongly believe that pregnancy is basically an immunological phenomenon. In contrast, our specialty believes that pregnancy is an endocrine, a hormonal phenomenon. Therefore, also, our specialty is called reproductive endocrinology. That's wrong, at least in our thinking. And we now have evidence, experimental evidence from the lab, again, partially developed by our colleagues at Rockefeller University in Ali Brimanlu's lab, who showed that in an artificial implantation model, for at least the first 10 days after implantation, an embryo completely normally develops without any input from the mother. In other words, no hormones, no nutrition, nothing. But that embryo is genetically foreign. And that embryo, therefore, should be rejected by the maternal immune system. Yet, that does not happen in the vast majority of women. Something happens to the maternal immune system that prevents it from rejecting that invading little tumor, as I like to call it. We now understand that is probably based on some signaling coming from the embryo to the maternal immune system, and what in immunological language is called induction of tolerance pathways, meaning that the maternal immune system reprograms itself so that it makes that embryo invisible to the immune system. The maternal immune system no longer sees it as foreign. And we believe that is the first thing that must work well for a pregnancy to be established and to survive. Other colleagues, or most of the field, are pointing at the fact that there's an endometrium, and the endometrium where the embryo implants is under hormonal control, etc., which is absolutely true. We are not saying that hormones are not important, but we are saying that hormones are not the quintessential first thing that must be right. And good evidence for that is that about 2-3% of all pregnancies are so-called ectopic pregnancies. Mm-hmm. No uterus, either in the fallopian tube, on the bowel, on the
no
omentum.
endometrium.
Some have reached viability in the belly of women. So uterus is not required, endometrium is not required, but immunological tolerance is always required. And if that immunological tolerance does not work well, implantation may not happen, or women may have miscarriages. And therefore, we believe in our philosophy, practically, it probably makes not much difference, but as a philosophical point, we feel it is very important. We believe that pregnancy is an immune phenomenon, first and foremost. And the reason why we think that it is important to emphasize that is because there are many colleagues who not only do not believe that that is the fact, but who are kind of till today completely poo-pooing immunology. Yes. Some very prominent and some very smart and excellent colleagues will to this day tell you, stop talking about immunology. Yes. It has nothing to do with getting pregnant.
Correct. Yes.
And we, for a very long time, obviously have been at the very opposite extreme, have published a lot on it, are still working on it. And there's, I hope in the very near future, some very interesting stuff coming out because we are doing, we are collaborating with colleagues at Rockefeller and at Sloan Kettering Memorial on something that, if it pans out, will be a great story.
The bottom line is that the immunology story is so complex that we're only just beginning to really understand it. Up until now, all we've been just like when you kick the television to try to make it work. We've got only the grossest ways of trying to interact with it. But I think that some of the work that we're starting to do in collaboration with these other places will shed some light and probably give us some direction to try to do this more effectively.
That's fascinating because it was, as you know, for some time, maybe in the 90s, very popular. There were all these, even at NYU had like an immunology program attached to their IVF center, I think. And it was very popular. Then all of a sudden it went away. So it's so interesting, your perspectives. And it's so true. I think most people don't think about these things.
That is always the danger when you overpromise. If you overpromise, the pendulum will swing back to the other extreme. And that unfortunately happened because some colleagues who were interested in reproductive immunology in the 80s overpromised, made everything into immunology. And so once that turned out not to be supportable, the pendulum swung back and colleagues went to the other extreme and said nothing matters. And unfortunately, there are still a lot of colleagues at that point.
So, we've talked about this idea of immunology and when people have their trigger and how their process develops in terms of developing eggs. We talked about implantation. We're talking about so many interesting things. And I know these are only a few tools in your toolbox and the ways that you think about patients. And I wish we had all day to talk about it. Unfortunately, we'll have to wind down now. But there are so many more things I know that you both do to try to help patients get pregnant. And there are so many subjects to talk about. I'm sure it's dizzying, but it's really wonderful that you are continuing to pursue this because there are so many patients who really do want to try with their own eggs or need to try with their own eggs for whatever reason, or their family members' eggs. And you're giving them this chance that they wouldn't already have. And I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for your thoughtfulness. And also, again, I want to highlight for everyone the informed consent process, which is so important for everyone to know, not just to go out to someone who's going to promise you that you can drink some snake oil and everything will be fine. It's really important to know all the details of what you're getting into. So thank you both so much for providing that for patients, and perhaps we'll continue more another time. But in the meanwhile, where can everyone reach you?
You can reach us by phone at 212-994-4400. We have probably the largest website in the infertility field at www.centerforhumanreprod.com. That's probably it. We are publishing a newsletter that you can subscribe for free electronically and for a few pennies printed. Any of those ways will keep you informed about what's happening at the Center for Human Reproduction.
Just to reassure people that, as many of us do these days post-COVID, we do a lot of our consults using the video consults. So even people who are not in the immediate New York area, we certainly can take care of you and talk to you and take advantage of this technology that's developed that allows us to talk to each other in this way.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Dr. Barad, and thank you, Dr. Gleicher. I really appreciate your time and your effort and everything that you're doing. And for all of you out there, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this helped you. And please reach out to them if you have more questions, and reach out to me as well at familybuilding.net. And of course, please, if you enjoyed this episode, press the subscribe so you don't miss any more. I'll see you next time. Hi, it's Lisa Schumann. I hope that you enjoyed that video and I hope it helped you. And if it did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe, because that's how we keep going. It's really important to us. And if you liked it, you might like this one.